She had been told to expect cruelty, but what she found was something she didn't have a name for: mercy. Nurse Aiko Matsumoto stood in the dusty courtyard of what the Americans called a processing facility, her wrists still bearing the marks where rope had cut into skin during the 3-day march from the field hospital where she had been captured. The August sun beat down on northern Luzon with the kind of heat that turns thoughts sluggish and makes every breath feel like inhaling steam. Around her, 17 other Japanese women, nurses, clerks, 2 teachers who had been running a school for officers' children, stood in a ragged line, their eyes fixed on the ground, their bodies tensed for the violence they had been trained their entire lives to expect from defeat. She was 24 years old. She had graduated from nursing school in Osaka in 1940, had volunteered for military service because the propaganda broadcasts said it was the highest honor a woman could achieve, to serve the emperor by caring for his soldiers. She had believed this, had believed everything she was told, that Japan was bringing civilization to Asia, that American forces were barbaric mongrels without honor, that capture meant torture and degradation beyond imagination, that death was preferable to the shame of surrender. For 3 years, she had worked in field hospitals across the Pacific, New Guinea, the Philippines, treating wounds that antibiotics couldn't reach because supplies had stopped arriving months ago, watching men die from infections that should have been survivable, rationing bandages until they were brown with old blood and had to be boiled and reused. She had learned to function on 4 hours of sleep and a daily ration that would have been insufficient for a child. She had learned to ignore the screaming. She had learned that the human body could endure more than propaganda ever mentioned, and that the glorious cause looked very different when you were holding a soldier's intestines in your hands, trying to pack them back into a wound that would not stop bleeding. When the American forces had overrun their position, a makeshift hospital in a burned-out church, Aiko had expected to die. She had been taught that American soldiers raped and murdered nurses, that they showed no mercy to women, that the atrocities would be so severe that suicide was the more honorable choice. Several of the older nurses had hidden cyanide capsules in the hems of their uniforms. Aiko had not been given one. There weren't enough. But the American soldiers who had come through the church door had not raised their weapons. They had shouted commands in English she couldn't understand, had gestured for the women to raise their hands, had separated them from the wounded Japanese soldiers with a clinical efficiency that seemed almost bored. No one had been struck. No one had been violated. The soldiers had simply processed them as prisoners, searched for weapons, bound their wrists, marched them north. Now, standing in this courtyard with dust in her mouth and fear sitting like a stone in her chest, Aiko waited for whatever horror would come next. An American officer approached. He was older, perhaps 40, with silver at his temples and the kind of face that suggested he had smiled more than he had frowned in the years before the war. He held a clipboard and was flanked by 2 soldiers who looked impossibly young and impossibly clean. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces were shaved. They looked like they had slept in actual beds and eaten actual meals. And this contrast with the emaciated, exhausted Japanese soldiers Aiko had been treating felt like a reproach she couldn't yet.
The officer spoke in English. A translator, a Japanese-American soldier whose face was carefully neutral, repeated the words in Japanese. You will be processed as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will receive identification numbers. You will be assigned to barracks. You will receive medical examination and treatment for any injuries or illness. You will be provided with food and water according to international standards. The words meant nothing. They were sounds, propaganda. The cruelty would come later, once the Americans had documented them, once they had established control. Aiko knew this. She had been taught this. The enemy always lied about mercy. But then something happened that she had not been prepared for. A young American soldier, he couldn't have been more than 19, with freckles and red hair that looked strange and foreign, stepped forward and handed her a canteen. Water. Clean water. He gestured for her to drink. When she hesitated, paralyzed by the cognitive dissonance of enemy offering sustenance, he mimed drinking, smiled with a kind of awkward kindness, and set the canteen in her bound hands. Aiko drank. The water was cool, tasted faintly of metal, was the most incredible thing she had consumed in months. She drank until her stomach hurt, until she remembered the other women around her, until she forced herself to stop and pass the canteen to the nurse beside her. The soldier didn't take the canteen back. He just nodded and walked away, leaving them to share the water among themselves. It was such a small thing. Water, the most basic element of survival. But it was offered without violence, without degradation, without the performance of dominance that she had been taught to expect. It was simply water, given because she was thirsty, as if that were reason enough. And in that moment, standing in a dusty courtyard with 17 other Japanese women, Aiko felt the first hairline crack appear in the certainty she had carried since childhood. A crack so small she could almost ignore it, but present, real. A suggestion that perhaps, just perhaps, everything she had been taught was incomplete. She did not know then that this crack would widen over the coming months until the entire structure of her beliefs collapsed. She did not know that the Americans would feed her better than her own army had fed her in 3 years of service. She did not know that they would treat her wounds with medicines Japan hadn't possessed since 1942. She did not know that they would let her write letters home, actual letters, not propaganda, letters that said she was alive and being treated well. She did not know that captivity would be the first time in 4 years that she would sleep without the sound of artillery in the distance, that she would wake without fear of being bombed or shelled or ordered to pack up the hospital and march to another location where men would continue dying because there was never enough medicine, never enough bandages, never enough time. She did not know that she would come to think of the American prison camp as something close to sanctuary, not paradise in any literal sense, but a reprieve from the nightmare that had been service to the emperor's cause. All she knew in that moment was that an enemy soldier had given her water, and that simple act contained a complexity she could not yet process, a truth that would require months to understand and years to articulate. The truth that mercy exists even in war, that humanity can persist even between enemies, that the labels we attach to each other, enemy and friend, civilized and barbaric, honorable and shameful, are always more fragile than we believe.
They were led to barracks that evening, long wooden structures that smelled of fresh lumber and disinfectant, not the moldy, overcrowded hospitals she had worked in, not the tents that leaked in the rain. Actual buildings with roofs that didn't have holes, with floors that weren't mud. Inside there were cots, individual sleeping spaces with thin mattresses and blankets that were clean. Each woman would have her own bed. This seemed impossible. In the field hospitals, nurses had slept in shifts on whatever surface was available, often going days without lying down at all. An American nurse, a woman with blonde hair and tired eyes who looked perhaps 30, distributed the blankets personally, handing them to each Japanese woman with a small nod that might have been acknowledgement or might have been simple exhaustion. She spoke no Japanese. The Japanese women spoke no English, but the gesture transcended language. Here is a blanket. You will be cold tonight. This will help. Aiko sat on her assigned cot, holding the blanket, feeling the texture of the fabric. Rough wool, military issue, nothing luxurious, but clean and whole without patches or bloodstains. She thought of the blankets in the field hospital, how they had been shared among 3 patients, how they had been so thin that soldiers shivered through the night, even in tropical heat, because fever made everything feel cold. That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in 3 years, Aiko could not sleep. Not from fear, though fear was present, coiled in her stomach, waiting for the cruelty that must eventually come, but from confusion, from the dissonance of expecting torture and receiving blankets, from the slow, terrible recognition that perhaps everything she had believed about the enemy was wrong. Around her, the other women lay silent. Some were crying, soft, suppressed sounds that suggested they too were wrestling with contradictions they couldn't articulate. Some prayed, whispering to ancestors or deities, seeking guidance for how to understand mercy from those who were supposed to be merciless. Somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played. The sound was thin, reedy, carrying across the camp on the evening breeze. An American song she didn't recognize. Not martial music, not propaganda, just melody. Simple, human, sad in the way that all music about distance and longing is sad. The sound reminded Aiko of her father, who had played shakuhachi, bamboo flute, in their garden in Osaka before the war. She had not thought of her father in months. Thinking of home was dangerous, created longing that interfered with duty. But lying in the darkness, listening to the harmonica, she remembered summer evenings when he had played while her mother prepared dinner, when the world had been small enough to comprehend and safe enough to take.
The harmonica stopped. The night returned to silence, broken only by distant voices, by the hum of generators, by sounds that suggested functioning infrastructure rather than improvised chaos. The camp felt organized, permanent, not like Japanese military encampments, which were always temporary, always about to be abandoned, always running out of some critical supply. This organization was perhaps the most disturbing thing. It suggested that the Americans had resources to spare, that they could afford to build proper facilities for prisoners, that the war was being fought by a nation that had not been depleted to the point of collapse. Aiko thought about the soldiers she had treated, boys really, 18 and 19 years old, dying from wounds that should have been survivable, dying because Japan's supply lines had been cut, because the Navy was gone, because the empire that had promised eternal victory was actually starving to death in jungles across the Pacific. She thought about how those boys had believed until the end that Japan would win, that the suffering had meaning, that the emperor would deliver them. And she thought about the American soldier who had given her water, who had smiled with that awkward kindness, who had walked away without demanding anything in return. What did it mean when your enemy showed you more compassion than your own officers had shown in 3 years of service? What did it mean when captivity felt safer than duty? These questions had no answers, not yet, but they lodged in her mind like splinters, painful and impossible to ignore. The medical examination, when bodies revealed the war's truth. The next morning, they were taken to a medical facility for examination. Aiko had expected this. Prisoners were always examined, cataloged, assessed for disease or injury that might affect camp operations. What she had not expected was the quality of the facility. The examination room was clean, antiseptic clean, the kind of clean that required constant maintenance and adequate supplies of disinfectant, luxuries that Japanese field hospitals had lost access to by early 1943. The floors were spotless. The equipment was modern. There were no bloodstains on the walls, no lingering smell of gangrene and death. An American doctor examined each woman individually behind a curtain that provided privacy, an absurd luxury when Aiko had spent 3 years treating soldiers in conditions where privacy was impossible, where men defecated where they lay because they were too weak to move, where dignity had been sacrificed to the necessities of survival. The doctor was gentle. He examined Aiko's wrists where the rope had cut,
cleaned the wounds with an iodine solution that stung, and applied bandages that were white and soft and clearly intended for single use rather than to be boiled and reused. He noticed the scars on her hands, burns from hot instruments, cuts from shrapnel when a bomb had hit near the hospital tent, the calluses that came from 3 years of manual labor and inadequate nutrition. He didn't comment, just noted them on his chart with clinical detachment. Then he checked her weight. 86 pounds. She was 5 feet tall, so 86 pounds was survival, but not health. The doctor frowned, wrote something on his chart, spoke to a nurse in English. Through a translator, he told Aiko she was malnourished and anemic, that she would receive supplemental rations to restore her health, that she needed rest and adequate protein and regular.
Aiko wanted to laugh at the absurdity. She was a prisoner of war. The enemy did not restore prisoners to health. The enemy certainly didn't provide supplemental rations. This had to be temporary, a performance. The cruelty would come later, once they had documented how much she weighed. But the doctor seemed genuinely concerned. He looked at her, not as an enemy or a category, but as a patient whose condition troubled him professionally. As if her malnutrition was a problem to be solved, rather than a deserved consequence of being on the losing side. When the examination ended, a nurse handed Aiko a clean uniform. Not American military, a simple cotton dress, used but clean, in a pale blue that reminded her of hospital scrubs. The fabric was soft, whole, without tears or bloodstains. "For you," the nurse said through the translator, "your uniform is not suitable." Aiko looked down at what she had been wearing, a nurse's uniform that had been white once, but was now gray with dirt and stained with the blood of dozens of soldiers she had treated. The fabric was so thin from washing and wear that it was starting to disintegrate. She took the clean dress into a changing area, another curtain, another absurd provision of privacy, and put it on. The transformation was immediate and disorienting. Clean fabric against skin that had been dirty for so long she had forgotten what clean felt like. A dress that fit properly, rather than hanging loose on a frame that had lost too much weight. When she emerged, the nurse smiled, a small, tired smile that suggested she understood something about transformation and dignity and the significance of clean clothes. That dress felt like more than fabric. It felt like a statement. You deserve to be clean. You deserve dignity. You are human, regardless of which side you fought for. And that statement, delivered through a simple cotton dress, was more devastating than any cruelty could have been, because it forced Aiko to confront the reality that her own nation had not made such statements, had not provided such dignity, had treated its soldiers and nurses as expendable instruments rather than as humans deserving care. That evening, they were taken to a mess hall for their first communal meal in American captivity. The hall was large, clean, organized. Long tables with benches, a serving line where camp personnel, both American soldiers and civilian staff, distributed food from metal containers that steamed in the evening air. The smell hit first. Cooked meat, bread, vegetables, real food, not the thin rice gruel or hardtack that had sustained them for years. The smell was overwhelming, almost nauseating in its richness after so long surviving on minimal.
They moved through the line, each woman receiving a metal tray that was then filled with portions that seemed impossible. Rice, white rice, not the brown rice mixed with millet that Japanese soldiers had been eating since supplies dwindled. Meat, actual meat, a portion perhaps 4 ounces, more than Aiko had eaten in a single meal in 2 years. Vegetables, carrots and beans cooked soft, bread, a roll, white bread, warm, and soup, a clear broth with noodles and vegetables that smelled like something from before the war, from a time when food was pleasure rather than mere fuel. Aiko sat at a table with the other nurses, staring at her tray. Around her, women were crying, not from grief, but from the overwhelming cognitive dissonance of receiving abundance when they had expected starvation. One nurse, Sachiko, 31 years old, who had been in service since 1938, whispered, "They're fattening us for something, making us healthy so we're worth whatever they plan to do to us." But another, Yumi, 26 years old, captured the same day as Aiko, shook her head slowly. Or perhaps they just believe prisoners deserve to eat. The table fell silent. This suggestion was too radical to accept immediately. That the enemy might feed them well, not as strategy, but as policy, not as manipulation, but as basic humanity, violated everything they had been taught. Aiko ate slowly. The rice was perfectly cooked, individual grains, not mushy, prepared with care. The meat was tender, seasoned simply but adequately. The bread was soft, fresh, still warm from baking. With each bite, she felt something inside her shifting. Not breaking, she was not ready for that, but loosening. The certainty she had carried, the hatred she had been taught to feel toward the enemy, the conviction that Japan's cause was righteous and defeat was merely temporary, all of it felt suddenly fragile, built on assumptions that reality was contradicting with every bite of well-prepared food. She thought about the meals she had eaten during 3 years of military service, the thin rice gruel that was mostly water, the hardtack that destroyed teeth, the occasional fish that was usually spoiled by the time it reached field hospitals. The gnawing hunger that had been so constant she had stopped noticing it, had learned to function in a state of semi-starvation that she had accepted as. And she thought about the wounded soldiers she had treated, how they had whispered requests for food, how she had nothing to give them, how they had died, sometimes not from their wounds, but from the malnutrition that prevented healing. Her own army had starved its soldiers while promising them glory. The enemy army was feeding its prisoners better than Japan had fed its nurses. What did this mean about which side was civilized? What did this mean about the propaganda that had shaped her entire adult life? These questions were too large to answer while eating dinner in a prison camp mess hall. But they sat beside her as she ate, demanding attention, refusing to be ignored. 3 weeks into captivity, the prisoners were informed they would be allowed to write letters home. This announcement was met with disbelief. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be allowed to correspond with family, but no one had expected the Americans to actually honor this requirement. Communication with home had been sparse even during active service. Military mail was unreliable, censored heavily, often taking months to arrive if it arrived at all. They were given paper and pencils. They were told the letters would be reviewed by censors, but would be sent through Red Cross channels to Japan. They were told to keep letters brief and factual. They were told they could send 1 letter per month. Aiko sat in the barracks with blank paper in front of her, trying to compose words that would make sense to her mother in Osaka, words that would explain she was alive without revealing the cognitive crisis she was experiencing. "Dear Mother," she began, then stopped. What could she say? That she was a prisoner? Her mother knew Japan was losing. The firebombing of cities had made that impossible to deny. But to admit capture, to admit she had surrendered rather than dying, would be to admit the deepest shame Japanese culture recognized. Yet not writing would mean her mother would never know she was alive, would assume she had died honorably, would mourn a death that hadn't occurred while Aiko was eating 3 meals a day and sleeping in a clean bed. She wrote slowly, choosing words carefully. I am alive and unharmed. I'm being held in an American facility. We are treated according to international conventions. We receive food and medical care. Please do not worry about my physical well-being. She wanted to write more, wanted to say that the Americans were not what they had been taught to expect, wanted to say that she was confused and questioning everything, wanted to say that sometimes kindness from an enemy is more disorienting than cruelty. But these truths were too complex for a censored letter, too dangerous politically, too devastating personally. So she wrote only facts. She signed her name, she folded the letter and gave it to the camp authorities. She did not know if it would reach her mother, did not know if her mother had survived the bombing of Osaka, which had killed tens of thousands in March, did not know if her family even existed.
But writing the letter, putting words on paper that traveled across enemy lines through some system of international agreement that apparently still functioned despite total war, felt like an act of resistance. Not resistance against the Americans, but resistance against the ideology that had taught her communication with home was impossible once captured, that prisoners were dead to their families, that surrender meant erasure. The Americans were letting her maintain connections, letting her remain human, letting her family know she lived. This was mercy, and mercy, Aiko was slowly learning, was more complicated than cruelty. Cruelty you could hate. Mercy you had to understand. And understanding required acknowledging that perhaps your enemy was better than your propaganda had claimed. By October 1945, 2 months after surrender, Aiko had gained 13 pounds. Her wrists no longer looked skeletal. Her face had regained some of the fullness it had lost during 3 years of malnutrition. The scars on her hands were healing under bandages that were changed daily with antiseptic care. She was, by any medical standard, healthier as a prisoner of war than she had been as a military nurse serving the emperor. This fact haunted her. Every morning when she woke in a clean bed, every meal when she ate food that was adequate and sometimes even pleasant, every evening when she had free time to simply exist without being ordered to some exhausting task. The other women were experiencing similar reckonings. They talked in whispers after lights out, conversations that would have been dangerous to have openly, but that became necessary because the cognitive dissonance was too great to bear alone. We were told they were barbarians, Sachiko whispered one night, that they had no culture, no honor, no capacity for mercy, but they treat us better than our own officers treated us. What does that make us? What does that make Japan? No one had answers, but the questions themselves were revolutionary. To ask whether Japan might be wrong, whether the enemy might be decent, whether the ideology they had sacrificed everything for might be lies, these were thoughts that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Aiko thought about the soldiers she had treated, boys who had believed in the emperor's divinity, who had accepted starvation and disease as necessary sacrifices, who had died whispering loyalty oaths to a nation that had sent them to die with inadequate supplies and no possibility.
And she thought about the American soldiers she saw every day in the camp, young men who looked bored more than brutal, who played cards during downtime, who listened to music on portable radios, who treated the prisoners with professional distance but without visible hatred. These were not the monsters of propaganda.
They were just men doing a job, following procedures, treating enemy prisoners according to rules that apparently mattered more than revenge. One afternoon, Aiko was in the camp medical clinic. She had been permitted to assist the American medical staff, her nursing skills useful even in captivity, when a wounded American soldier was brought in. A training accident, the medics explained. Nothing serious, but requiring sutures. Aiko watched as the American doctor treated the soldier with the same careful attention he showed to Japanese prisoners. The same clean bandages, the same antiseptic protocols, the same gentle handling. The doctor noticed her watching, spoke through the translator. All patients deserve care. Nationality doesn't matter. This is what medicine means. This simple statement, nationality doesn't matter, contradicted everything Aiko had been taught. Japanese military ideology was built on the premise that nationality was everything, that Japanese people were inherently superior, that the war was justified because Japan had a divine right to rule Asia. But this American doctor was saying that medicine transcended nationality, that care was universal, that humanity mattered more than which flag you served. And watching him suture the soldier's wound with the same care he had shown cleaning Aiko's infected hands weeks earlier, she understood something that felt both obvious and earth-shattering. The Americans believed in principles that didn't change based on whose side you were on. They believed in rules that applied to everyone. They believed in rights that existed because you were human, not because of which nation you belonged to. This was the foundation of the Geneva Convention, the idea that even in war, even between enemies, certain standards of treatment must be maintained, that prisoners deserved food, shelter, medical care, communication with home, not because they had earned it, but because they were human and humans had rights. Japan had never taught this. Japanese military ideology had taught that rights were privileges granted by the state, that individuals existed to serve the nation, that loyalty to the emperor transcended personal well-being. But the Americans were demonstrating a different philosophy, one where individuals mattered, where prisoners had rights, where the enemy was still human and deserved to be treated accordingly. This realization didn't come as a single moment of clarity. It accumulated gradually through hundreds of small observations, through meals that were adequate, through letters that were actually sent, through bandages that were changed daily, through being called by name rather than by number, through small gestures, a guard holding a door, a nurse smiling when checking her weight, a doctor explaining treatment in language she could understand.
Each gesture was small, but accumulated, they built a picture of a society that valued individuals, that believed in human dignity, even for enemies, that operated according to principles rather than merely according to power. And this picture was so different from what Aiko had experienced in 3 years of Japanese military service that it forced her to question everything. But with understanding came guilt. Aiko lay awake at night thinking about the soldiers she had treated, boys who had died believing in a cause that had betrayed them, who had accepted starvation as necessary, who had thanked her even as they died from wounds that should have been survivable if Japan had possessed the medical supplies these Americans seemed to have in unlimited quantities. She thought about how she had encouraged those soldiers, had told them their sacrifice mattered, had repeated propaganda about Japanese superiority and inevitable victory, even as evidence accumulated that both were lies. She had been complicit, not in planning the war or making strategic decisions, but in maintaining the ideology that had sent hundreds of thousands to their deaths. She had been a nurse, had saved lives when possible,
But she had also participated in a system that valued loyalty over survival, that saw soldiers as expendable resources rather than as humans deserving care. And now she was alive and being treated well while those soldiers were dead. The guilt was crushing. Some morning she woke and wished she had died with them, that she had maintained the illusion rather than surviving to understand the truth, that she had died believing Japan was righteous rather than living with the knowledge that she had served an empire built on lies. Other women experienced similar guilt. They talked about it cautiously, afraid that admitting doubt might be betrayal, but unable to bear the weight alone. One evening, Sachiko said quietly, "Sometimes I think death would have been easier than this." Then understanding that everything we believed was wrong, then being treated well by people we were taught to hate, then having to rebuild our entire understanding of the world while living in a prison camp. Aiko understood. The body's survival was relatively simple. Give it food, shelter, medical care. But the mind's survival was far more complex. How do you continue when everything you based your identity on has been revealed as false? How do you live with guilt for complicity? How do you accept kindness from enemies without feeling like a traitor to the people who died still believing? There were no easy answers. But slowly, through conversations in the barracks, through the accumulation of days that did not bring the expected cruelty, through the routine of captivity that was somehow more humane than service had been, Aiko began to construct a new...
Perhaps the guilt was necessary. Perhaps it was the price of understanding. Perhaps living with the knowledge of what her nation had done, of what she had unknowingly participated in, was a burden she deserved to carry. But perhaps there was also a way forward. Perhaps understanding could become the foundation for a different future. Perhaps the women who survived captivity and learned these truths could return to Japan and help build something better. This was not redemption. Guilt doesn't dissolve that easily. But it was purpose, a reason to continue, a suggestion that survival might have meaning beyond merely not dying. In December 1945, as the first anniversary of their capture approached, something unexpected happened. The camp administration organized a Christmas celebration. Not for the prisoners. They were primarily Buddhist or Shinto. Christmas meant nothing in their religious traditions. But the Americans celebrated, and the sound of it drifted across the compound. Carols, sung by soldiers and staff, simple harmonies, voices rough from cigarettes and shouting orders, but sincere in their attempt at beauty. Silent Night, and O Come All Ye Faithful, and other songs Aiko didn't recognize. She stood near the barracks window, listening. The music reminded her of the harmonica she had heard her first night in captivity, reminded her that beauty persisted even in places designed for confinement, reminded her that humans create music because we need music, because life without beauty is merely survival, and humans require more than survival. Then something remarkable happened. One of the American soldiers, the same red-haired young man who had given her water that first day, who she now knew was named Eddie, though they had never directly spoken, began singing a Japanese song, Sakura, the cherry blossom song. Every Japanese child knew it. It was as fundamental to Japanese identity as the national anthem. His pronunciation was terrible. His accent was thick, but he was singing it, singing her song, creating a bridge across the divide of nationality and war through the universal language of music. The women in the barracks came to the windows. They listened in silence as this American soldier, this enemy, sang their song, sang it with obvious effort and care, as if he understood that music could communicate what words could not.
that beauty shared was connection created. When he finished, there was silence. Then, from somewhere in the women's barracks, someone began singing the next verse. A Japanese voice, continuing what the American had started. Then another voice joined, and for perhaps 3 minutes, Japanese prisoners and American soldiers sang together across barbed wire. Not in any organized way, not as performance, just as humans who shared appreciation for beauty, who recognized that music transcended the political divisions that had brought them together as prisoners and guards. When the singing ended, Aiko found tears on her face, not from sadness or even from joy, but from the overwhelming recognition of shared humanity, that her enemy could sing her song, that music could create connection that ideology had tried to eliminate, that beauty persisted even in a prison camp, even between nations that had tried to destroy each other. In that moment, Aiko understood something that would shape the rest of her life. War creates enemies, but humanity is stronger than war. The labels we use, enemy and friend, Japanese and American, prisoner and guard, are real in their effects, but constructed in their nature. Beneath the labels are humans who create music, who appreciate beauty, who can recognize each other across every divide if given the opportunity. The Americans had given her that opportunity, not through grand gestures or propaganda, but through small human acts. Water when she was thirsty, clean bandages for her wounds, adequate food, letters home, and now music, beauty shared across the divide that war had created. These were not strategies. These were expressions of a philosophy that valued human dignity regardless of nationality. A philosophy that said prisoners deserved care not because of who they were, but because they were human, and being human was sufficient reason for decent treatment. This philosophy had transformed her, had broken the certainty of propaganda, had revealed that the enemy she had been taught to hate possessed a humanity and moral framework that her own nation had abandoned in pursuit of empire. In March 1946, 8 months after capture, Aiko and the other prisoners were informed they would be repatriated. Japan had surrendered. The occupation was underway. Civilian prisoners were being returned home. The announcement created complex emotions: relief at the prospect of seeing family again, if family still existed; fear about what kind of Japan they would find; anxiety about how they would be received as women who had surrendered, who had survived captivity, who had been treated well by the enemy; and surprisingly, a kind of grief. Grief at leaving a place that, despite being a prison, had been safer and more humane than military service had been. Grief at leaving the routine of captivity that had paradoxically felt more stable than the chaos of war. Several women admitted quietly that they were afraid to leave. Not because the camp was paradise, it was still captivity, still barbed wire and controlled movement, but because it had been the first place in years where they had been treated with consistent decency, where they had received adequate food and medical care, where they had been allowed to be human rather than merely instruments of military policy. The night before departure, Aiko wrote a final entry in the diary she had kept throughout captivity. March 14, 1946. Tomorrow, we return to Japan. I should feel joy, but I feel only uncertainty. I do not know what we will find there. I do not know if my family survived. I do not know how we will be received as women who surrendered and were